When you think of a sci-fi MMO, it's not exactly a category that is ripe with titles. I've already covered a few of the largest on my channel. But what if I told you there was a sci-fi MMO that came before those, and very likely was the first of its kind? Hailing all the way from Norway and developed by console adventure game pioneer Funcom, Anarchy Online launched in 2001 as one of the first sci-fi themed MMOs. Funcom's first MMO and their main reason for the shift to focusing on PC titles. But although Anarchy Online was innovative in many ways, especially in 2001, it suffered from one of the worst launches in MMO history. A launch that would both hamstring the title going forward and educate future developers about the trials and tribulations of MMO launches. It's been nearly 2 decades since the launch of Anarchy Online, and although the game has had a more recent engine overhaul and a Steam launch back in 2017, the player base has considerably shrunk since its heyday. If you're watching this and you haven't heard of Anarchy Online, don't worry, you're not alone. In fact, that's a big reason why I wanted to cover the game on the Death of a Game series today. Why is Anarchy Online both so revered by developers and OG MMO vets, and yet forgotten all the same by the general player base? On this episode of Death of a Game, we uncover the mystery behind Scandinavia's powerful sci-fi MMO that helped shape and change the MMO industry, and how it failed to appeal to a broader audience. Welcome to RubyCaw, ladies and gentlemen. Funcom is a video game company we had covered on the series already that hails from Oslo, Norway, and had nearly a dozen console games spanning the 90s, most notable being the Longest Journey series, by famed Scandinavian game developer pioneer Ragnar Turnquist, which launched in 1999 and would go on to be one of the most iconic adventure games ever, probably my favorite. Funcom had aspirations to work on something bigger though, and with the same successful designer and writer in Ragnar, and a new team that grew steadily to at least 70 developers. What sort of setting would they choose for a new multiplayer online project would be a mystery. For the time, the online RPG market didn't consist much of MMOs in general. 1996 at the start of development on Anarchy Online, and MMOs were still new and budding projects with seemingly limitless potential and dangerously unknown risk. The other multiplayer online games, MMOs, or even MUDs for the time were largely fantasy. Funcom producer Colin Cragg said regarding their choice for Funcom to tackle the sci-fi realm, "There are many of us who always preferred laser guns to swords. This is one of those rare times that the laser gun fans won." Taking inspiration from a world like Shadowrun, Anarchy Online being one of the first sci-fi MMOs already out of the gate was trending to be innovative. Funcom would show off Anarchy Online to the public in the summer of 2000. The setting of Anarchy Online consisted of the world RubyCaw, where inhabitants were focused on mining the precious material known as Nodum. Like Shadowrun, ripe with business of all kinds, individual clans, and a powerful corporation on top of it all. 30,000 years into the future, with a planet captured by a military regime. The Omnitech faction is basically the Circa of Anarchy Online space, RubyCaw specifically. It has affiliations all over the galaxy, but their primary goal is just simply money. You could choose to play as the Omnitech, or you could choose to play as the rebels fighting against their regime, or you could remain to be neutral. More details concerning Anarchy Online were revealed on September 3rd, 2000. According to the GameSpot article, Funcom was running an internal test group of 600 players already, with plans to extend to 15,000 to stress test the game's servers. All of the beta testing was taking place in Norway, though the main servers were planned to be based in US. To coincide with their push to further their western reach, Funcom would open a US office in North Carolina for customer service and server purposes. With EQ having launched back in March of 1999 and reached the super stardom that we all know it to have today very rapidly, Funcom was looking to get some of that success. Anarchy Online would have a slew of public betas going into 2001, where they were slowly inviting in testers by the hundreds. GameSpot would get their hands on with the new budding title March 21st, 2001, and had the following to say about their player experience. Though Anarchy Online is still in its early stages, it looks excellent. We saw several wilderness areas, as well as an industrial city and a dance hall. All of these environments were extremely detailed. There are 4 of the playable races in the game and 11 available professions. With another serious test planned for the summer of 2001, GameSpot and many others were putting Anarchy Online on the to-watch list as an extremely promising title. When GameSpot would get the chance to preview the game again, they would end their thoughts stating that, all things considered, Anarchy Online seems extremely promising, even in its pre-release state. Funcom would announce the launch date of AO set for June 27th, 2001. Funcom even declared that Anarchy Online would be competing head-to-head against the likes of EA's Ultima Online, Sony's EverQuest, and Microsoft's Asheron's Call. Before the launch, Anarchy Online would be showcased at E3 2001, May 22nd. GameSpot, okay look, to be fair, GameSpot is kind of the only source I can find from like 19 years ago, so sorry I can't find other kinds of articles to kind of change things up. Public beta testers have already seen that areas like Omni One Forest seem practically empty. We saw a much more fully fleshed out version of the same area that was practically unrecognizable, as it was heavily populated with polygonal trees and foliage. GameSpot mentioned that Anarchy Online seemed much improved from its previous showcasing, and had the addition of vehicles and the ability to traverse the map through kiosks, aka the grid. Things are looking promising for the launch to follow the next month. The question would remain, however, had enough testing been done globally? This would and will be a question for many MMOs then, now, and to come. A test that took place 2 weeks before launch featured 100,000 players downloading and playing the game over different servers. Anarchy Online had impressive interest for the time and was full steam ahead on affecting the MMO scene led by titans. Anarchy Online wasn't trying to be a humble MMO, or a clone of any of its competitors. In fact, it was quite ambitious in its own right. It was promising to have 12 classes, dynamic, / radiant questing, world PvP, and the storyline that was supposed to span over the course of 4 years and accompanied by an animated series? The 4-year storyline they mentioned seemed to almost sound like a development cycle of sorts, that they would continue to evolve the game in that 4 years with new quests, dynamic content, such as NPCs migrating, and PvP, and more. With an event team focused on dealing out the story through different means, it was almost too good to be true. All of this for $50 plus a $15 subscription fee that you could live out your sci-fi fantasy while continuing to get new updates? Sign me up. But could they possibly deliver on all of that? In 2020, that feature list already sounded massively impressive. If Anarchy Online could satisfy even just a small portion of that feature promise, it would be an impressive title for the history books. Impressive game or not though, Anarchy Online would be set in the history books for all the wrong reasons. Anarchy Online launched June 27, 2001 to quite possibly one of the worst launches in MMO history. Each game copy needed to register a CD key, which Funcom was having issues processing as well as being charged twice for the same key. Coupe that with download issues of the game, server lag, and the server itself crashing, it was everything bad about a launch personified. Of the 100,000 players who tested the game, Anarchy Online would sell 35,000 accounts at launch, which despite being a 35% conversion rate, is actually incredibly impressive. Funcom's CM stated of the launch troubles that the number of subscribers we had at launch were much more than we had anticipated. Funcom was asking media outlets to not review the game so they could take a few weeks to fix things. Bombing the opening review cycle as an early 2000s video game would be damning. Something Awful naturally didn't listen, aka the Goons. They tried the game out at the time of launch, and well, their experience was just about as great as everybody else's experience with them. With Funcom begging for a grace period, and people likely unsubbing by the minute, they were going to have to pull a rabbit out of the hat to pull Anarchy Online out of a hole it already found itself in so early in its history. Failing a launch is usually a death sentence for an MMO, but Anarchy Online would prove to be resilient. With Funcom's reputation on the line and their newly shifted focus towards PC online games, they needed Anarchy Online to do well. Funcom's apology for the launch problems came July 2nd, a few days later. We have not charged any accounts, nor will do so, until we are at 110% that everything is in order and correct. Making the game free and fixing existing account issues was certainly a step in the right direction, but with servers and performance for many players being literally a slideshow, Funcom wasn't out of the woods yet with Anarchy. Worst of all, no media reviews or not, many players were already starting to question where some of the promised mechanics and features were. For example, the 4-year story that hadn't even begun yet. Funcom wasn't just facing issues with maintaining their MMO, but they had seemingly pushed it out a little bit uncooked out of the oven. Funcom wasn't going to give up yet though. They would unveil a trial month July 9th, 2011 for Anarchy Online in a brilliant move to keep those who bought into the game as well as attract future players. With numerous promising changes and fixes coming to Anarchy Online, and Funcom's staunch support, Anarchy Online was picking up momentum and the review embargo would be lifted in August of 2001. Aggregate review website Metacritic from 11 critics scored the title at a middling 72 out of 100. IGN, who reviewed the game, had the following to say concerning their impressions. This game has the potential to be the best MMORPG ever, and I've seen it work in the right beta phases, so I know what it can do once the technical issues are fixed. Unfortunately, we can't review a game based on potential. We have to review it based on the facts, and the facts that our Anarchy Online simply isn't up to spec right now, because of a few major bugs that still need to be worked out of the system. Giving Anarchy Online a 7.2 out of 10, which for reference EQ scored an 8.4 with them and UO roundabouts the same. Other reviews from major outlets were generally better, with GameSpot giving Anarchy Online a 76 out of 100, GameSpy giving a cool 80 out of 100, and Playboy giving a 65... Wait a minute. GameSpy and GameSpot had similar takes. Both major journalists were putting Anarchy Online up there with EQ once it got past its technical issues, and that's certainly high praise. Choosing to double down on the PC subscription market, Funcom, predominantly a console game maker, would exit the console market. A few days later, Funcom would detail some of the reasons concerning their launch woes. It has been difficult to log on due to massive traffic, and the game is unfortunately still unstable. We apologize for all the inconvenience this has caused our customers, and we are working around the clock to make things right. Well, that's kind of explaining why. They, as the CM had previously mentioned, didn't expect the load, but I don't know if that's exactly all. We would like to inform you that the first included month of playtime will not start until further notice. Funcom can also assure you that most of these issues will be solved in the near future, that we will work very hard to prove that Anarchy Online is the very best online there is. To satisfy those customers rightfully still peeved about the state of affairs concerning Anarchy Online, Funcom would host another trial week in September of 2001. The promised live story for Anarchy Online would finally come a few months after launch, October 31st, 2001. The story would be accompanied by a fully animated and voice-acted episode, which would coincide with additions and changes made to the game itself. Players would have the ability to affect the outcome of events, which for 2001, like with Asheron's cost system, who I mentioned in another Death of a Game did something similar, is incredibly impressive. 2020, it's something we still don't really see attempted. Funcom was even promising in the future to allow central players to be featured in the story, which was something that we haven't really seen done. According to IGN, Anarchy Online globally had sold 60,000 copies at launch. By November 2001 in the US alone, it had crawled up to 47,356, which as GameSpot highlights, was rather low and not that impressive. Still, this would place the player base at overall over 60,000 players, and by my estimations, probably over 80,000 by the turn of 2002. By June 2002, Anarchy Online had grown to a reported 150,000 accounts, but if those were actually copies sold or just accounts that were legacy made whenever it was a beta, the data doesn't really back that up. This would prove to be a peak of theirs though. In that same year, PC Gamer awarded them the MMO of the year. Funcom would take that momentum and roll into their next content update, expansion, or as they prefer to call it, a booster pack. The booster pack, Nodum Wars as dubbed, would be priced at $20 and would launch later that year in 2002. Nodum Wars would bring land control in the form of towers, being one of the first MMOs to feature asset PvP, as well as introduced flying vehicles into the game, which was kinda TBC before TBC. GameSpot's verdict on the booster pack was as follows, scoring it a 6.8 out of 10. Should you pick up Nodum Wars? If you're an Anarchy Online veteran, then yes, the game's complex land control battles will offer you a considerable, though somewhat flawed challenge. If you're a player who quit because of the game's technical problems at launch last year, but you still find the game's sci-fi setting and unique sense of style and humor interesting, then yes, Anarchy Online isn't perfect yet, but it's been improved greatly, especially in terms of stability. Meanwhile, IGN, who was more favorable, granted the game an 8.8 out of 10, stating that, for existing Anarchy Online players, I don't see how you can go wrong with adding this to your collection. For anyone considering the game, it now has a much better new player experience, and for only $20, you get the booster and the original game, so it's not much of a monetary drain. Funcom bundling Nodum Wars with the original copy of the game was a good idea, but Nodum Wars wasn't the savior that Funcom needed yet. It was a step in the right direction though, especially with the likes of yet another sci-fi pioneer MMO to launch the next year, my favorite MMO of all time. SOE, or Sony Online Entertainment, backed by Sony Pictures, would go on to launch Star Wars Galaxies, led by industry vet and online RPG pioneer Raph Koster of Ultima Online fame. While I'm clearly biased concerning my favorite MMO ever, I think it's fair to say that Star Wars Galaxies launching in June of 2003 meant that Anarchy Online was going to have to put something out big to rival it. Luckily for Anarchy Online though, Star Wars Galaxies launched without the space component and kinda was unfinished. It was rather a large part of the Star Wars world, which might have bought them the time that they needed to do what they were about to do next. Originally set for the launch of August 26, Anarchy Online's first expansion, Shadowlands, would launch instead September 9th, 2003. Shadowlands would add 225 new areas to the game, 165 different instances, and new zones with new monsters to kill. There would also be an increased level cap to 220, 2 new professions, and a whole slew of other things. While Funcom gets credit for one of the worst MMO launches ever, they also should get credit for one of the best MMO expansions ever. IGN gave the expansion a great 8.8 out of 10. Shadowlands not only meets its rivals head-on in terms of content for players of all levels, but in many ways saunters past them without breaking sweat. There is just so much to see and do, even that the most established players will still be making discoveries for months to come. If you leave your preconceptions at the door and take the plunge, you may just discover that the next generation MMORPG you have been waiting for is already here. Competition might have been heating up in the MMO world when Titan's EverQuest 2 and World of Warcraft set to launch later the next year, but Anarchy Online was seemingly doing great, performing aptly from the hole that they started in. The population was slowly increasing for Funcom, but the subscriber numbers for Anarchy Online weren't wowing anyone yet. Funcom would secure a significant chunk of funding in April of 2004, $4.5 million that would be used to, as Funcom CEO put, enable us to further increase our investment in the development of the next generation of online games and to become even better at what we excel at. Now, I might be looking into this, but they didn't exactly mention Anarchy Online, and they said online games plural, which tells us they were planning on more online titles. This surely meant that Anarchy Online could lose some steam or some support, but I don't exactly blame a developer for leveraging their current successful online title, at least somewhat successful, to attempt to create another online world. Because I don't think that online worlds are supposed to last forever, well, at least not yet, because we're not there yet with technology. If Funcom was embracing the darkness and land components of Anarchy Online with their Shadowlands expansion, Alien Invasion, as the name implies, was all about the space and aliens. The Alien Invasion expansion launched in October of 2004 and featured a brand new beginner area, player-created cities, new quests, and the Alien Invasion mechanic, which allowed guilds to trigger alien attacks. IGN, who reviewed the expansion, explained that in overcoming a rocky start, Anarchy Online has evolved in every important aspect with potential appeal for individuals whose preferences range from role-playing to power leveling, solo to grouping, and hardcore to casual. Funcom has made its award-winning title even better. Anyone looking out for a massively multiplayer game to play or to switch to should certainly check it out. By this point of the population data, you can see the effects of WoW and many other MMOs launching on Anarchy Online, as despite positively received expansions, the game was now starting to lose population ending 2004, down to barely over 30,000 subscribers, and it wasn't really going up. Funcom pivoting off of Anarchy Online to make new online titles wasn't really seeming strange anymore. Anarchy Online, which had impressive features, was looking and feeling dated by the end of 2004, having been released at the turn of the century when innovation was practically light speed, which was a problem that many other games that were released between '98 and 2002 had. Funcom would go on to do yet another innovative thing in the MMO market: test the free-to-play model. Yep, in response to poor subscription numbers and wanting to explore other options of monetization, Funcom would announce a free-to-play version of their game. This would make them one of the first Westerner developers to do such. There would still be a subscription service in the game, or a premium service, but they would section off some of the content behind a aka paywall, aka the subscription wall. The interesting thing about this is that it created a form of discrimination in the game. Froobs, as they were often dubbed, were derogatorily called free noobs, essentially, and these were players who didn't pay the subscription, which gave you a bunch of benefits. The success from the change, though, was immediate, as Anarchy Online quickly jumped up to 400,000 players at the end of 2004, and then a whopping 700,000 in 2005. According to Funcom's financials, microtransactions had reached an impressive 1 million, which put the game at generating a total of 28 million since launch. And more efforts to attract players, new and returning, Funcom would make all of their expansions and booster packs free starting June 28, 2006. These were previously placed behind the paywall. This is actually something that City of Heroes would go on to do later on as well. December 2006, we see the last major expansion for Anarchy Online, Lost Eden, which preceded the ending of the world story of AO. Lost Eden was almost entirely focused on PvP and overhauling it, with the introduction of battle stations and the research skill system. The battle station system was essentially Battlegrounds in a nutshell. Games Radar, who reviewed the expansion, enjoyed the new battle station PvP, new missions, and stat tweaks in the game. While they couldn't ignore the dated graphics, clunky gameplay, non-intuitive interface, and consistent lag issues, it seems that no matter how much Funcom upgraded the content in Anarchy Online, the container itself was already flawed. Funcom was well aware that their online title was fading, as they do, and had intentions of overhauling the engine for Anarchy Online with their new Dreamworld engine that they were going to borrow from their upcoming Barbarian-themed MMO, Age of Conan. This would seem like a thing that would happen over the next year or two, but nobody could quite anticipate that this process would take another near 8 years. Funcom had more pressing matters at hand though, working with the famed Conan IP and equipped with new funding, a new engine, and experiences garnered from AO to go forth and launch Age of Conan. That game had its own episode on this series, but the important part of the story here is that Age of Conan was a bestseller and was now clear and away the breadwinner for Funcom. Anarchy Online by 2008 was still chugging along, reaching 200 million hours of playtime and more than 2 million player accounts, though seemingly its time in the sun was slowly coming to an end. By 2009, Funcom financials barely even mentioned Anarchy Online, other than revenues being steady, which doesn't really tell us much. 2008 through 2009 would prove to be an interesting year for Funcom. Although Age of Conan was selling like hotcakes, like Anarchy Online, it unfortunately was suffering from a poor launch. Whether it was unique or Funcom didn't learn from their mistakes, Age of Conan was now getting negative reviews and players were leaving in droves as people realized the game wasn't what was sold to them. Even the lead developer and part founder of Funcom, Gott Godagger, left over this dissatisfaction. Funcom taking risks seemingly over their career would pay off, but either have some sort of catch or be kind of fleeting. There was always some sort of casualty. Funcom might be flawed, and boy are they flawed technically, but they, unlike a certain company, Hi-Rez, were loyal to their games and didn't abandon support so easily. Anarchy Online would receive another booster pack / mini expansion titled Legacy of the Zan, which essentially was to serve as a modernization of Anarchy Online, adding in-game raiding and dungeons to the game. This would have been a perfect time to unveil that new promise engine overhaul. However, it turns out that originally Funcom stated that they were intending to use the upgraded Ogre engine, which was the original engine for AO, but instead decided to go with the aforementioned Dreamworld engine, which is kind of an ironic name because it's the name of their virtual reality MMO game that's present in Dreamfall, their adventure RPG game. The engine switch meant that the engine overhaul was nowhere in sight, and no major media outlets even covered the Legacy of the Zan update, generating little buzz. Good news did finally come in September of 2010, when the Game Archaeologist interviewed game director Colin Cragg, and he stated that the engine revamp was looking on track for a 2010 beta and a Q1 2011 release. Things would only continue to slow down for Anarchy Online. In February of 2013, when in a controversial but understandable move, Funcom would consolidate the last 2 servers. This was controversial because simply the game was roleplay centric, and some players believed that each server had its own unique ecosystem and community, and well, merging the servers kind of changes that. But I don't disagree with the developers' decision to try and keep their now 10-year-old game alive, even if sometimes, as I mentioned before, there's casualties. The engine update would be teased yet again in September of 2013, as it would begin closed beta testing under an NDA. Okay, either Funcom really loves their game Anarchy Online, or it's weird that they treat this engine update kind of like it's Fort Knox. The engine didn't come in 2013 though. In fact, it didn't come in 2014 either. We wouldn't see the famed graphical engine update until June 25th, 2015, nearly 8 years after being originally announced. To be fair to Funcom, at this point I doubt they were trying to do it for a monetary gain, and at this point it very well was just satisfying a promise made to their original online core audience, kind of like an artistic promise. Funcom will stumble, but their fans are kind of always there to pick them up because they make things interesting and fun, just maybe not so balanced or polished. They have a loyal fan base. In the everlasting trend of launching a decade later on Steam, Anarchy Online would launch on Steam February 22nd, 2017, 16 years after its original launch. With Funcom taking money from Tencent though, it meant that things were different this time around. Accompanying the launch on Steam was a new $90 level boost, and boy do I hate level boosts. Mainly because it's essentially the developer or publisher profiting off the fact that they can't fix their new player experience or pre-expansion content. I understand that iterative expansions can cause balancing problems, and perhaps lower the quality of certain content, especially age-wise. But why are we paying for your mistakes? When an MMO is old enough to see half a dozen CEO changes, executive suits being involved, new management, it's gonna have some problems in quality or in vision. The fact that Anarchy Online was lasting so long was, well, basically the problem, right? The Steam charts following the launch seemed to barely move at all, with population data being small enough to fit in a single room. Anarchy Online was slowly fading out of the market, as natural with many other pioneer MMOs. AO would join the classic server craze with a classic server of their own March of 2019. While Steam isn't the only place that people can play the game, and certainly it's not always the most accurate place to get data from, it doesn't seem like much movement happens post-classic server launch. Anarchy Online might have been slowly fading away before, but now its existence was very much in the "oh, that's still around" category. Before I get into my deduction where we gather clues obtained along the way and combine those along with our evidence to tell the story of Anarchy Online and how it never got quite the same shine its bigger brothers did, I want to talk about some of the most unique aspects of Anarchy Online. Anarchy Online is a pioneer in the truest sense of the word. Featuring voice acting, world story that carried out over the course of 4 years, which occasionally would allow players to effect the change, this is like a decade before SWTOR dedicated their entire game to such. Or even Funcom's later The Secret World. Anarchy Online from a storytelling perspective was ahead of its time, on top of the fact that with this story it was accompanied by an animated series. Now, people thought Defiance was super impressive, and don't get me wrong, a full live-action show is more impressive than an animated one in this context, but Funcom doing an animated show in 2001? Now that's impressive. Anarchy Online, much like Star Wars Galaxies, was down the other path of online multiplayer RPG. If WoW was going left, they were doing hard rights in terms of their sandbox design and player interactivity. Whereas WoW focused on more linear vertical progression, Anarchy Online was more open-ended in this regard until their final mini-expansion really. Anarchy Online, also unlike WoW, wasn't an RPG light, where stats are squished, hidden, and not fully explained. Nope, Anarchy Online took the textbook approach with it. No, literally. The skill system in the game looks like a textbook, full of 83 skills by the way, which isn't exactly friendly for new players, but I respect that about AO, as I do with Star Wars Galaxies as well. I much prefer knowing exactly what my stats do and how they affect my character versus having a developer squish everything down to only combat modifiers and stats and then basically tell me what my character is doing. I mean, we are playing an RPG after all. I should also mention that Anarchy Online had user-generated quests, player housing, territory PvP, flying vehicles, and more before WoW or other MMOs posts were even out. AO was truly ahead of its time in more ways than one. The final key feature of Anarchy Online that I wanted to highlight shouldn't be a mystery to those that are fans of the game, and that's the soundtrack. If you haven't been jamming already late into this video, then maybe you just don't like sci-fi music. Anarchy Online's soundtrack to me screams sci-fi, but it's not just synth waves and sirens and robotic noises, there's other softer bits too. The kind that actually tug on your heartstrings a little bit. But it's natural I'm fond of the soundtrack when it's done by the same creators of The Longest Journey, which I love that soundtrack as well. Now that's not Anarchy Online music, that's, you guessed it, deduction time. After hearing the story regarding Anarchy Online, we still have our key thesis at hand surrounding it all. Why didn't Anarchy Online appeal to as large of an audience as perhaps expected? Perhaps you are already ahead of the curve and have followed the trail of clues leading here, but if you haven't been keeping up as much, here's my journal. Historically, one of the worst game launches ever. Anarchy Online came at the turn of the century, where innovation was light speed. Outshadowed by other more popular and bigger funded MMOs. Funcom shifted focus towards new online projects. Natural causes, we all die someday. Anarchy Online might be one of the first major indie MMOs, so was kind of Dark Age of Camelot and RuneScape, but that's a story for a different time. Anarchy Online is still in existence today, and playable on Steam, quite impressive for a 19-year-old title. The underdog Western world, Norse developer Funcom, flawed or not, has created a sci-fi world that has not only stood the test of time, so far, it's inspired many other future MMOs. Funcom would go on after Anarchy Online fame to make quite a few prestigious but flawed MMO titles. At this point, you can almost call it the Funcom. They're absolutely talented, but you can't promise that the game will work as advertised at launch. But what is the legacy of Anarchy Online? Well, hopefully with videos like this, people will not forget the sci-fi MMO that came before Star Wars Galaxies. Jokes aside, I don't think I need to say some nice words here to speak to the legacy and the ripple effects caused by Anarchy Online's influence. To those who played the game, and the developers that are still in the industry, you guys know why the game was influential, and what it meant to you. Thanks for watching, guys.
Welcome to Crucible.